everybody. And for those of you that, if you're new to the vendor, welcome. This is a wonderful institution. I should just remind you, actually, I made a very memorable visit to Vendor in its very origins, when it was a massive collection stored in an office park in Ladera Heights. And I went there with the mighty Ruth Seymour, who, R.I.P., our dear Ruth passed recently, but we wandered the massive vault of artifacts and firemen's costumes and paraphernalia and Justin Jampol's extraordinary findings from the Eastern Bloc. And at that point, this was just a twinkle in his eye. And then by the time I met Yus here, it was already manifesting as this cultural center. And now a few years later, it's become, well, in my view, one of the most interesting and exciting museums in LA, genuinely. It's an incredible asset for Culver City, and I'm sure Justin will lose no opportunity to tell you about the next stage, which is the Cultural Center, emerging at the back of this marvelous garden, all of which actually leads to a conversation about what is the role of a museum in society today, and Joe and I will probably touch on that a little bit as well. But before we get to that point, we are going to spend, at least sort of 30 or 35 minutes on Joe's book. It is being presented here in sort of conjunction with the exhibition, Visions of Transcendence, but in many ways it's telling perhaps a different story, although an interrelated story, and we'll get to how much it might be interrelated later, but let's stay with the book. So, Corrections and Collections, Architectures for Art and Crime, came out in 2013. But the book landed on my desk at KCRW, and I had that feeling of, whoa, that's an interesting, extremely provocative title, and read it and was just amazed by it. It was just one of those incredibly original, interesting books. It is very much embedded in the kind of deep knowledge that Joe Day has of architecture, but it goes far beyond that. I did interview him at the time for KCRW. It is wonderful that Yus has reprised the book for the conversation now. And so anyway, for any of you that hasn't read it, we're going to talk about it for a little bit. And as I say, return back to how it might relate to the show here. So, Joe, now I turn to you, and you start answering some questions. The book, in which you delved into what really was a highly provocative, also sort of troubling connection between prisons and museums. At the time you were writing, both had exploded in number since the 1970s. At that point, you wrote, there are more than 2 million inmates in the American prisons and jails. And at the very same time, museums were hosting more than 2 million daily visits. Extraordinary numbers there. You explained that prisons and museums, though diametrically opposed in terms of public engagement, class representation, and civic pride, are complementary structures employing related spatial and visual tactics to secure and array problematic citizens or priceless treasures. That is quite a contention. Tell us what sort of, was this a book about a very original book of architectural criticism that was coming out in this claim, or was it an evaluation of the politics, the socioeconomics that were producing this extraordinary parallel growth?
Well, thank you, Frances. And before I get too far, Yus and Justin, thank you so much for hosting us today. And Frances, it was a pleasure to speak with you when closer to the release, and wonderful to kind of delve back in, because a decade makes a difference in terms of a lot of these questions. It's certainly at the time Corrections and Collections was coming together, and I should cop to this in case, and I suspect some of you in the audience are working on books. This one had a long gestation before 10 years ago. And really through my schooling and beyond, and I should say my interests were sequential. I had been very, very interested in prisons as an undergraduate in college. I done a thesis on prisons and proposed a prison in the cloverleaf of the 10 and 405 freeways for my senior thesis in college.
Why? Why were you so interested?
You know, well, and this is a theme that will come up a number of times. I'm very, very interested in how architecture can choreograph vision. And prisons are, among other things, fundamentally about who gets to see, both building types are about who gets to see what, when, and why. Prisons are fundamentally about who oversees who. And my thesis proposal was in the cloverleaf because the cell blocks themselves were structured as kind of parabolic billboard structures over the cloverleaf, so that commuters stuck in traffic would participate in the surveillance of the prison. Idea that you probably only have at 20 or 21.
Yeah, but still, why? Were you interested in the judicial system? Were you interested in justice? Were you interested, did you want to improve prisons? Did you want to see more people incarcerated?
Certainly not. And actually that, I would say that even from those early days, I think my first interest in prisons, and this would be true for a lot of people that tip into this subject, I read Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, which is important. Really a discipline changing. In fact, people within the penal system will talk about Foucault and how they were trained as I had a guard talk to me about panopticism, and it was an incredibly important work. It was one of those works of theory and criticism that really found its way into the world. I think it's very hard to read that book, and it's interesting that guards were reading it in their training. It's hard to read that book and come away more enthusiastic about incarceration, and I certainly wasn't. The basic premise at 20 was more people simply need to know this is happening, that it's happening, and very few Americans are aware of how many people we incarcerate. We are incarcerating more, and frankly, through the 80s and 90s, we incarcerated exponentially more as I was getting more and more interested in it. And so I would say my first rationale was simply almost journalistic, that architecture needs to perform a role of exposing and clarifying an issue that seemed long suppressed. And I think that is still a theme. We don't, for as many people as we incarcerate, and it was 2.2 million when I finished corrections and collections. I hope we're down, we appear to be down under 2 million as a country, and that certainly constitutes progress, but that still puts us outlandishly in the extreme in the developed world. We incarcerate, I think, 8 times as many people per capita as the Japanese, at least 4 or 5 times as many as the EU taken collectively. So that honestly, and I feel like this is an ethic I return to fairly often with both prisons and museums. There's a lot that could use some defamiliarization, or use some familiarizing. Thank you. Yeah. Demystification.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get to that, but just quickly, let's just understand why there was this seemingly sudden and exponential growth of both in the 70s, because it starts with the same family, the Rockefeller family. Can you talk about that?
It does, and this came up, as I should say quickly, in graduate school I got fascinated by museums, but actually through the lens of a single family. I was obsessed with a family of architects turned artists called the Matas, Roberto Mata and Gordon Mata Clark, who will be familiar to some of you. I designed a museum for that family. Thank you.
Radio, years in radio makes you do that kind of thing.
I'm with the pro. Pardon me there. The Rockefeller family played a huge and pivotal role in the expansion of both prisons and museums. I would say more riding the current of some of the political enthusiasms of the time than necessarily inventing them. But interestingly, the sons of Abby Rockefeller, of course, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York. And he ended up in an interesting and heated rivalry with our own Ronald Reagan. I have a copy of the New York Times published on my birthday, January 3rd, 1967, an inauguration day for both of those governors at which they announced their tough on crime policies. So it was a birthright. both governors were in a rush to pass harder and harder sentencing guidelines, especially for drug offenses. And Nelson Rockefeller, of the two of them, had delved in more deeply. He had a friend who had lost a son to a heroin addiction. And it was actually related to the family of Bonwit Teller. That friend of his went around the world looking at correctional systems, trying to find ways that people had dealt with drug addiction and drug use more effectively than we had. And he stumbled on the model of Japan, which had an unbelievably draconian, very, very incredibly long terms. If you dealt drugs, you would never see the light of day again. And he brought this back to Rockefeller, and it became kind of a template for the Rockefeller drug laws, which passed in New York, kind of, in a number of forms, or kind of escalating forms, over the late 60s and early 70s. At the same time, his brother John Rockefeller was in Congress, and he was part of what they call the Rockefeller Republicans, a kind of a long extinct variety of Republican, really, who were interested in urban dynamics and supporting urban culture. And John Rockefeller drove through a series of tax reforms that made it very, very easy for art patrons to donate their collections and to support buildings for the arts with incredible tax advantages. And I note in the book, and it's an irony worth considering, that it didn't extend to artists actually donating their work. This was really directed at the patron class. But in any case, the Rockefellers and Abby Rockefeller had gotten MoMA off the ground. So this is a family that was really fundamental to launching the museum boom throughout the 20th century, but especially in the latter half of it.
Right. So explain that, and it's incredibly important history. But the book isn't necessarily. The book doesn't go on from there to then become a kind of critique of capitalism, where one is giving tax breaks to the wealthy to donate art, which the money that might otherwise perhaps be redistributed to more opportunities in education and benefits
or housing,
or housing that might actually provide better circumstances and ameliorate or lessen the chances that perhaps a poor kid in an urban situation might find themselves on the prison track. That's certainly something that could be where that argument goes. But your argument then circles back to the architecture. And this is where we get to this sort of incredibly, again, interesting sort of provocative connection that you have made between the design of museums, the design of prisons. You've mentioned panopticism, which I think has its origins in England, actually. At the college I went to, UCL. Yes, because Jeremy Bentham, who came up with panopticism, was the founder of the school. But your book actually goes through various phases of I guess, architectural expression that manifest in prison design. But you sort of kick off with minimalism, and particularly this guy called Lou Kahn. Can you just speak to that? And then we're going to move on to your presentation, and then we'll come back and sit down again. Sure.
So Louis Kahn is, in many respects, the godfather of both minimalism in art and architecture. Although in art he would be in a crowded, fast field. Louis Kahn designed 3 museums that really changed the way American collectors and patrons of the arts thought about buildings for art. Really, in a way, he made it possible for Americans to think about museums as something other than a neoclassical pile, as something really, he brought the language of modernism and then an even more reduced vocabulary of minimalism into play. He designed, and he also launched, and this is a kind of minor tulip craze that I was fascinated with in the book, colleges built a ton of art museums, not unlike the scale of the one we're enjoying right now. And Louis Kahn's art gallery at Yale really launched that whole subgenre. He built another museum there for British art, which actually was important for how it factored retail into its lower floor, how it did actually, Francis, bring a little bit more into play with the art. It really was an interesting paradigm for urban renewal, which is an important part of this. Just one last thought before we leave. In our conversations this last couple days, Francis, you've emphasized the origin of my story in the convergence of prisons and museums and minimalism. That it is in it's in that movement that we see a kind of convergence in these two, an unlikely and unusual convergence in these two building types. And I believe it really was museums feeding off of certain penitential tropes or habits native to prison design. Architects, since the Enlightenment, have liked prisons as a building type because it gave them a pretext for using blank walls and less ornament. And if you were a modernist, prisons oddly gave you a bit of, made a bit of your case for you off the bat. It's Louis Kahn that really kind of takes that notion and develops an entire kind of luxurious language of spare, unadorned architecture that became kind of a habit in museum design.
So Spartan is an aesthetic that, yes, architects sort of since the birth of modernism have been extremely attracted to. You do make a distinction between modernism and minimalism, though. Can you just explain that?
Sure, and I'm eager to do it here because the Venda is party to this distinction. A simple way to think about it would be, in this case, there's sort of contemporary, or the architecture of the 20th century before the Second World War and the architecture of the 20th century after it. And many people will tell you that contemporary architecture is the architecture of the moment, and modernism relates to a series of early vanguard movements, mostly really launched through other media, through other disciplines, painting in particular in the early 20th century, and that's not untrue. But as in terms of these two building types, what's built before the Second World War and before the Cold War would be broadly construed as modernism. What rises to the fore quickly after the Second World War, even amongst the major modern masters, and I talk a little bit about the trio of Wright, Mies van der Rohe, and Corbusier, who have actually hugely important museums that were considered, kind of in their mind's eye before the Second World War, but happen after it. Those buildings and cons really sharpen the constraints on what would be state-of-the-art architecture in the 40s and 50s going into the 60s to this reduced vocabulary, a more monumental, a neighboring movement would be brutalism, but minimalism in art and architecture really sort of takes over from modernism as the dominant strain of the expression of kind of the developed West, really.
But it goes hand in hand with what's going on in art, and Donald Judd becomes an important figure. Explain that connection.
Hugely so. And Donald Judd, I think one of the revelations that led to Corrections and Collections was learning more about the minimalist generation, and I needed to because they actually landed between Roberto Matta, a surrealist, and Gordon Matta Clark, his son, was, well, a post-minimalist, which is a complicated term, but between them was minimalism, and I didn't know much about it in school. So I spent a lot of my 20s and early 30s learning about minimalism. And Donald Judd, oddly, Donald Judd has this incredible compound in Marfa, Texas. And he had a fascination with architecture. The only architect he spoke positively about precisely two architects, to my surprise. The first was Louis Kahn, who he felt really in this new kind of minimal, more monumental modernism was pioneering a new sensibility. And oddly, for those that are interested in the politics of all this, he was a fan of Philip Johnson, which is more unusual, but Philip Johnson and his partner David Bailey were hugely savvy and enthusiastic supporters of art of the 60s and 70s in general, including minimalism. So art and architecture kind of fed off each other even on that level of kind of support between the fields.
So while minimalism both in art and architecture becomes a sort of, exquisite taste of the affluent and the cultivated, meanwhile, that very same aesthetic is being used in the most punitive and Spartan way in the prison situation. And you wanted to draw people's attention to that perhaps, are you trying to sort of suggest that there's almost kind of a decadence in our appreciation for the void, for emptiness, when for those who are incarcerated, this is a thoroughly miserable environment.
It is exactly an environment of deprivations. I do feel like there is a gap of irony between, and irony perhaps is too kind a word, between the audience, between different audiences and their experience of these two building types. I think, Francis, it's also important in terms of just to touch on the context of the 60s and 70s that these emerge out of. For what it's worth, the United States wasn't building a ton of prisons as they started to build more and more museums. There's really a kind of interesting overlapping sine curve of these two buildings. The prisons of the 50s and 60s often went back when, we actually weren't incarcerating that many people in the 40s coming out of the Second World War and the 50s. In the 60s, we started doing so more, and with mandatory minimums for drug sentences going into the 1970s, our prison population exploded. As the show documents in an interesting way, different parts of the world have different surges on this side of the equation. Mm-hmm. But our run in incarceration, and I think actually the resort to minimalism, the broad appeal of minimalism in some ways, was also tied to what was going on in American cities in the 60s and 70s. It was viewed as an antidote to urban malaise. The hectic chaos, the perceived chaos of American 60s and the 70s was often met, and this was true actually into the kind of urban renewal schemes that led to Bunker Hill being leveled and huge moves like that in the 50s and 60s. There was a sense that American cities in the 50s and 60s were losing their sense of order and rhyme and reason, and minimalism was often kind of brought to bear as a kind of antidote to that.
But it also was about rationalism and a kind of reductivism, which found its expression in the design of these increasingly supermax prisons that started to appear. So there was also that interest in I guess, maximizing expenditure. Was that a piece of the story as well?
Absolutely, and it becomes a more and more central part of it. As we started to build more prisons, we realized we didn't build them very well. And that's an important part of this puzzle that I think I can unpack a little bit as we go. But I should say that my intrigue with these two building types is related but different. Both are building types that are governed relentlessly by relationships of vision, but they're also building types that I think distill the ambitions of my field in very, very different ways. Museums are considered by architects kind of the high game of the field. If you follow museum news, you'll see that they're the commissions that architects have historically competed for most avidly. They're the ones that elevate singular talents most dramatically. Prisons are almost the opposite. Prisons are almost always designed either by big corporate practices or almost anonymously by prison agencies themselves. They happen under the radar. However, they do something that architects, especially architects when they're young and in school, kind of flirt with as a fascination of our field. They control people's lives more avidly than any other building type. And I think a lot of people enter into architecture with often, I think they're benign versions of this, but a real ambition to help people lead better lives and to structure those lives, to improve their lives. And prisons on some levels, and the whole idea of the penitentiary, and the penitentiary is a 250-year-old idea, the penitentiary was meant to reshape people into better human beings. It's actually based on a kind of monastic prototype, and the penitentiary was at least imagined as an antidote to older, more draconian and pre-democratic modes of incarceration that were strictly and simply punitive and often very short in duration because people didn't survive them long.
And there are many different ways in which people are imprisoned, and certainly one can go to countries and find very different models. And even you mentioned Japan being an inspiration to the Rockefellers, but based on what I read from your book, actually, even though they had those draconian anti-drug laws in Japan, they didn't apply them very often.
Very infrequently.
But the Rockefellers saw that example, I think it was Nelson, and said, "Hey, that's a great model. We'll apply it. Let's scale it up." And they did, and we ended up where we're at with an enormous incarceration of drug offenders.
This is a huge theme. This is a huge theme in both building types, but especially incarceration. Good intentions gone bad could really be the title for the history of the building type.
Right, right. And with that, Joe, you do have a presentation, is a condensation of what's in your book. So let's jump to that, and then we'll come back and talk about the connection to the show.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep this necessarily brief because on this oblique, I have an idea of what slide you're looking at, but I'm not absolutely sure. So this, and I'll try to be brief. This is we did a series of models, and this presentation begins and ends with them. It is actually where I sort of tipped into, I used them at either end of this presentation because it was where I tipped into this question of art and architecture within our studio. And I was trying to isolate my fixation with these buildings, why I was so intrigued by them. So we built what we called these relief models. And they were diptych reliefs. In this one, on the left is the panopticon, which we've talked about a little bit. We'll touch on both of these a little bit more, but the Guggenheim and the Panopticon were a really important dyad for me in terms of thinking about museums and prisons. We'll take that a little bit further. I realize now to forward this.
Oh, I think
it's here?
There we go.
Got it.
Let's see.
Thank you. Let's see if, there we go. So I know I can tell from here and from there, this is the table of contents and not easily seen probably by any of us. What I hope you can see is a bright white line kind of in the middle of it. And I bring that up. Corrections and Collections is organized as in 4 sections of 2 chapters apiece, so 8 chapters, but paired in 2s. And to Francis's point earlier, they were paired minimal and post-minimal, millennial and post-millennial. And the hard white line there, to me, is really where the Cold War is, the conclusion of the Cold War in 1989, 90. Historically, the rough chronology of Corrections and Collections is really to either side of the Cold War, because I actually do believe a lot of what we were doing in this country and what was going on around the world as it relates to either of these building types and to the lives affected by them had a lot to do with that rivalry in its early dimensions. I think actually the interplay between cultures and frankly, certainly below that line, the rise of before, above the line in the Eastern Bloc, the USSR and its policies of incarceration or forced labor would be the antipode or would be the complement to ours. Below the line, the rise of China and the way state-run capitalism takes advantage of its labor supply and develops forms of incarceration very different from our own. In any case, that split was important. I think above the line, minimalism and post-minimalism are both in both art and architecture about a language of reduction and simplification, and a kind of elevation of abstraction as a kind of absolute good. In minimalism, the abstraction of the volumes themselves. In post-minimalism, the relationship between objects and bodies. And if you're interested in post-minimalism, Michael Fried wrote a great essay about art and theatricality and how at a certain point when minimalists start making objects, all of a sudden you can't talk about the art without talking about the way people move around through them. And that became very important for me in thinking about how the boom in prisons and museums in the 80s really picks up that theme. I'll keep going. I stick to above the line mostly today, but the millennial and post-millennial conditions are definitely more a part of my life these days. I should say at this point, my third typological obsession is the cinema. And most of my time since finishing Corrections and Collections, I've been teaching and thinking and writing about movie theaters, which is frankly more pleasant than either of my previous 2 obsessions, but equally based on the construction, on the orchestration of vision and who gets to see what. So this is, as Francis mentioned, this is Louis Kahn in his bow tie in the upper left, and that's actually a piece by Sol LeWitt, on the right, a cubic construction. Soluit is roughly a peer of Donald Judd, a foundational figure within minimalism, but also someone who interestingly tips into what happens afterwards. And this I include, this was really the first image in the book. I was so proud when I got my hands on it because it seemed like such a clear evidence that this art had something to do with prisons. Every time I see that, I'm reminded of a tour I took of Folsom Prison in the late 1990s. Folsom Prison in Northern California was built famously in the mid to late 1800s, crafted completely by its inmates who quarried the granite stone that forms the 4-foot thick walls of most of its cell blocks in order to, it's like it's something out of Borges. You know, it's an incredibly hard place, but also an interestingly heroic place within the prison system. Both correctional officers and the incarcerated actually compete to get sent to Folsom. It's considered bragging rights to have spent some time there. See if I can get here. This is a piece by Donald Judd. This is in Marfa. This is one of a series of concrete enclosures. You know, I think Donald Judd is most famous for kind of box-like constructions that do and don't rival paintings as they're hung on walls or stand in front of them. But when you go to Marfa, you see that Judd would have loved to have gone up in scale into a rather, you know, into I think an even more perhaps penitential vocabulary as he started to think about his art as, you know, his art in the landscape. And there are a series of, I believe, 24 of these objects along one perimeter of Marfa. Marfa is a very important town in two senses related to my book. It's become sadly important to immigration dynamics along the Texas border. During the Second World War, Judd's compound, which is a converted Air Force base, was actually a detention center for German prisoners of war. So when you go through his galleries there, they've left German signage directing the prisoners of war through that complex. So Judd too. There was an odd. There were at different times with corrections and collections, there were different states and different times that really drew things into focus, and I would say, for minimalism, Texas ended up this odd crossroads of a lot of different important people and issues. So here I'm leaving minimalism behind us, and for better or for worse, I haven't included a ton of the kinds of buildings, Francis, that you and I have been talking about. I presume,
imagine them.
Yeah, I think they are, for better or for worse, they're both familiar and memorable for reasons good and bad. In the 1980s, we really start to build far more museums and prisons. And the reasons for museums are varied, but the reasons for prisons are quite straightforward in this country. Mandatory minimum sentencing for drugs, especially in the big states of California, Texas, New York, and Florida, and federal statutes that tried to keep pace with them. Sadly, even under both, in the 80s and 90s, Republicans, I want to be careful here, and I don't really want to delve too deep into politics, but law and order politics were largely coined by the GOP, but in the 80s and 90s, they were all too often and tragically echoed by Democrats. So both parties are party to this, but really not equally, and I want to emphasize that. We built a lot of prisons, however, and the one shown here is typical of what's called a new generation justice facility. One of the things we realized as we started to build more prisons is that we built them poorly before the Second World War. We built long buildings with lots of cells on either side of a hallway, and we would take those cell blocks and put them around a hub or put them as they are at Folsom, just sort of, each one on their own. But we were, the way, in terms of surveillance, most of the time, people weren't, for better and for worse, people weren't being watched where they were. It was the hallways between them that were visible. in the 1980s, there was a resurgence of I'm going to jump ahead here. There was a resurgence of interest in what's called a panoptic prison. And it's come up a couple of times, but it's an important, without the panopticon and without its revival, a revival that solved some of its initial problems, there couldn't have been the prison boom that there was. The panopticon is a cylindrical building with cells loaded around the perimeter and a guard station in the middle. It was invented by Jeremy Bentham and his brother Samuel. It was actually, the first was built in Russia, actually, and this would be in the early 1800s, actually as a factory. It was built under Catherine and Prince Potemkin in order to build the Russian Navy. And exactly that argument that we need to see what people are building all the time led to the construction of the first panopticon with, oddly, a house in the middle of it, not a tower, because the manager of the factory was supposed to live in the middle of it. Jeremy Bentham took his brother Samuel's idea and started to develop it and actually tried to get the British Parliament to fund it as a prison, but also as a hospital. Like, he was game to do it any which way. And Bentham wanted to build them because, I'm going to show you Bentham and Frank Lloyd Wright here.
Who was stuffed, wasn't he? He was stuffed
and
kept in a glass cage.
He was indeed incarcerated himself at the London School of Economics, your alma mater. Bentham is a hugely fascinating figure. He is most famous, most enduringly and really legitimately famous for being the godfather of international economics. And a lot of his work on trade between nations is still foundational and relevant and actually rather enlightened in terms of how nations can both compete and support and further one another's goals. So Bentham is not without his virtues. He was, however, an unbelievably intense voyeur. And the panopticon was a manifestation of this unbelievable fascination with seeing how other lives were led. In that sense, he was party to an economic movement. The utilitarians in general were trying to figure out neoclassical economics through looking more carefully at how people did things, in particular how they made them and made them more effectively. So Bantham's another talk. Bentham developed the panopticon, and a few of them were built to total catastrophic results. The Dutch were enthusiastic. They built them. They were very expensive, unbelievably spatially inefficient, and because they were in the round, whatever was happening behind the guard got people into trouble. So a few were built in the in the early 1800s, and then they were abandoned. Actually, the Cubans, and I'm sorry to have trimmed a slide with a number of Cuban panopticons. A few were built, but frankly, they were roundly derided, and for most of the 20th century, deeply out of favor. But when we decided, actually California is really the pioneer in this regard, when we decided we needed to incarcerate far more people really quickly, we realized, A, that we needed to incarcerate them in smaller groups, that we needed it to be under 100 people we were holding in any one place because larger numbers than that riot. And we needed to do so in a way that the most efficient number of people could both build the prison and oversee what's going on in it. So, and I promise not to go backwards ever again in this presentation, but this is the interior of what's called a 270 block in the California state prison system. And this is a remarkable building. It's square in shape rather than round. It's square with something like its envelope flap pulled out of it, with a sally port under the middle of it and a guard station. And it is a model of economic efficiency from the tilt-up construction, the timing of its erection, down to the number of people that need to staff its oversight. And it's because of that quick evolution in a new kind of cell block that California was able to break all kinds of records in incarcerating its new drug offenders and others. But that's how we as a state went from 30 or 40,000 inmates at the eve of 1970 to over 200,000 by the turn of the millennium. So that's It's, for what it's worth, that's one of the major kind of architectural stories to this puzzle. That's a more classic panopticon. I should say, and that's the interior of the Guggenheim, which I hope rings a bell or two. So the panopticon and the Guggenheim are both, to begin their descriptions, roughly 100-foot diameter cylinders. They both have a perimeter and a deep atrium. They are, however, after that, very, very different kinds of buildings. And the Guggenheim, which Frank Lloyd Wright actually based on the prototype of a parking helix. He had built a showroom for Mercedes-Benz a little bit further downtown from the Guggenheim. Still stands, and some of the ramps there. He had this idea in the 40s and was able to realize it in the 1950s. But the idea of a kind of gallery as this endless extrusion, as a kind of ramp where you have a wall for the art, floor for the viewer, and some kind of skylight or something that allows those two to be in communion, was a hugely important. The Guggenheim has a lot of issues, but it really was an incredibly provocative building. Artists hated it initially. Painters, in particular, hated the Guggenheim. Over 50 painters signed a protest at the opening of the Guggenheim saying their work couldn't be exhibited in that building because to see their paintings on an uneven, downsloped floor would completely alter one's reception of the work. And this is actually a hallmark of innovative architecture as it relates to art. There are a lot of artists who don't love what architects try to do for their work, and many of them have good reasons for that. However, another part of that trope is that the next generation of artists will find a way to capitalize on it. They'll find a way to take advantage of it. And what saved the Guggenheim was minimalism. Once artists were making objects, not paintings, that big open atrium environment and the way you could draw connections between spaces became hugely important and valuable. And the Guggenheim hosted, along with actually the Brooklyn Museum of Art, really launched that movement in a series of huge shows. Move through these. I realized I did this, and it's a diptych. Like, this is a little bit. I want to avoid the diptych of white men habit here, but there is a little bit of one. I apologize there. This, I'll move through this one quickly, but I varied the chapters and corrections and collections between what I viewed as a kind of architectural innovation in one building type or the other, or both, that somehow fed or related to something going on in the other, and then another chapter that had to do with the dissemination of those ideas, and often the kinds of outlandish figures, and Justin, you'd have some heroes in this pantheon, of people that took a really innovative idea for a museum or a prison and brought it to unprecedented, sometimes unthinkable scale. And so these two guys, this is Don Novi on the left and Thomas Krenz on the right. I suspect here Thomas Krenz may be a slightly more familiar figure. Thomas Krenz was the director of the Guggenheim for most of the last 20 years of the 20th century and really drove its expansion. Importantly for all of us in Los Angeles, and especially Los Angeles architecture, the Guggenheim Bilbao, arguably Frank Gehry's defining masterpiece, wouldn't have happened without Thomas Krenz on the right.
And his protege was Michael Govan.
True.
Just FYI.
Hugely important. And I have a cousin here with two kids at Williams where they both learned their craft. Thomas Krenz led an unprecedented expansion, took the whole idea of franchising a museum and really developed new and unforeseen possibilities. In exactly the same years, I think I have a little bit of a flow chart here. If I can. So just in quick passing, that is 32 of California's 33 prison campuses. I believe over half of those were completed or launched by Don Novi. Like, he really is, to Thomas Krenz's example, Don Novi really was really impressive in terms of what he did and how he was able to do it.
And he was head of the prison, the very, very powerful union that pushed for so much of this prison construction.
Thank you, Francis. He was the president for many years. He had actually been a guard at Folsom, and he ended up the head of what's called the CCPOA. That's the I'm not going to get the
California
acronym.
Correctional Officers,
Officer.
something or other association or something.
Thank you.
Anyway, we used to cover them on Which Way LA. They were
Got
very
it.
powerful.
A few years ago, that rolled off my tongue. But he was an interesting and in that world, actually considered really a heroic figure, not just for building a ton of prisons, but also for bringing correctional officers up to the same pay tier and arguably the same kind of societal levels of respect that police officers enjoyed. The first thing he did was link the compensation of guards to police on the outside, arguing that they actually had the toughest beat. That was really his slogan going in. What Don Novi and Thomas Krenz have in common, and this is, I think, actually central to the Venda and many institutions, they both realized that the fastest expansion of prisons or museums depended on both taking older existing buildings and making them work, and inventing new prototypes that allowed you to build bigger, better, and faster than ever before. And the two-sidedness of that's very important. So that with Krenz, there's the work he did on the Guggenheim mothership in New York. There are a couple of adaptive reuse projects in Europe that happened, or actually a really interesting one in Las Vegas, and then a new big Guggenheim Bilbao. Don Novi was similarly smart about maxing out the kind of capacity and potential of his existing stock of buildings, pushing for ever more draconian sentencing guidelines, and actually one of the things both of them did that's very important is they identified new audiences in support of their endeavors. And in Thomas Krenz's case, he was famous for expanding the board of the Guggenheim and figuring out how to bring younger fortunes that would have generally supported the arts into the arts faster. In the case of Don Novi, what Don Novi did was to politicize and kind of turbocharge victims' rights groups. He figured out that the politics, at a certain point, when people start to get uncomfortable with how much we're spending on incarcerating, when you need to make the case that we still need to incarcerate more, what you need to do is get the families of victims in front of microphones to explain how terrible a crime has been in their own lives. So in any case, this is their buildings. It scales a little bit, but these two, and I called them avatars of a polarized future. And Francis, I wanted to take a little bit of time with these two because polarization has been a theme that's only gotten more stark in the 10 years since.
Societal polarization or political polarization?
Frankly, I would say polarization almost as a universal theme.
Oh, right.
And hopefully, there's some amelioration at this point. But certainly, as I was finishing Corrections and Collections, that issue of societal polarization, of the economic polarization that you touched on, frankly, sadly, prisons often get a big turbocharge at moments of extreme wealth polarization. It's a hallmark of it. But I'm going to jump. I'm almost done with mine, and I've got a few shots of the show here. I know you can't see this out there, and I apologize for that. But this is a diagram of a bunch of new museums that were built in the post-war period. On the left are what I call neo-Duchampian museums. And in neo-Duchampian museums, Duchamp is famously the artist that coins the ready-made, that takes a ready-made object and makes it art by naming it so, and perhaps by putting it in a museum. And I believe Duchamp, in some ways, is the godfather of adaptive reuse. That Duchamp is where we get this idea of rarefying what is familiar and making it new. And there are a lot of museums, and a lot of the important museums maybe arguably most of the best of the last 30 years have been museums that have taken existing buildings, often industrial shells, and turned them into something incredible. And I got into the nuances of how they do that and why they do that. On the other side is what I call counter-Duchampian museums. And the counter-Duchampian ones are more kind of the museum as grand gesture. Museums that are about, frankly, often an architect's expression to rival that of the artists that would be included, or to argue that the arts in general deserve a level of freedom and autonomy that can be expressed at all scales. So I imagine we'll turn that a little bit. almost out. So millennial, just below the line, and I'm not touching much on this, but right around 2000 and into the 2000s, museums and prisons. Oh, up. Oh, I feel like I need I'd be happy to talk about millennial and post-millennial trends if you want to, but I'm going to move on because we've got plenty to talk about here. On the post-millennial, I would just say those two chapters are called Collide and Disperse, and I think the collision of the carceral and the collision of crime and art became very interesting to me, and this is actually where I find my connection with the show here. The idea of artists as criminals, of art as crime has certainly surged to the fore in the last 20 years in some remarkable ways. To a degree, I think, where you could argue there are many artists who view crime almost as their medium in interesting ways.
What do you mean by that?
I think I mean that both in the kind of sensational sense of terrible crimes being committed by people that on some pathological level see their crime as an expression of creativity. I do mean it in that sick way, but I also mean it as actually where I mean it most is in terms of political protest. So an artist like Ai Weiwei, who's touched on in this show, Ai Weiwei will conceive of a project understanding the threat it poses to his liberty, and he will move through it. In fact, an early work of Ai Weiwei's was to take a Tang vase and simply drop it and smash it, which some would have argued was a crime in its own right, but which he viewed as an expression of a culture that was his and a culture that was his to redefine. So I think there are artists who take transgression up to and beyond what we view as a criminal transgression and make that their work. I should say transgression in general is really a driving theme for me with corrections and collections. I believe we have a boom in prisons and museums because in the post-war period, we figured out how to define criminal transgression to an ever finer grain and allocate punishment accordingly. And on the other hand, cultural transgression rose to the fore as a means of defining and redefining contemporary art. So that a lot of contemporary art museums of contemporary art will, among other things, showcase work that is first and foremost a kind of cultural transgression. Does that stand to reason for the time being?
Yeah.
But I think from there, and I fear I have run on. Now we're here, and here I think if it's all right with you, Francis, I feel like I've made the terrible mistake of not keeping a fantastic conversationalist in the conversation enough.
No, I'll
do these quickly because all of you can go see them. But this is the overview of the fantastic show inside Visions of Transcendence. I liked the overview in part because you really do see. One of the striking things to me about the show is the choice not to go with white walls, which usually code gallery space and are certainly an important trope in minimalist museums, but to go with gray and to do so with this kind of quick, brilliant exhibition strategy that both does and doesn't have a kind of cellularity to it. I think echoing a little bit of the authorship of the art involved. I wanted to just touch on a couple of artists in particular because I think this is really important, that the work of artists who are incarcerated or who have been incarcerated, I think is first and foremost a plea and an offering to be identified as an individual, to not be a number within a system, but to have the work seen and understood and taken on at a level with the respect you would show a fellow citizen, because at the end of the day, incarcerated or not, these are our fellow citizens. And I think Leonid Nedov's work is a remarkable opening sequence to this idea. Nedov was incarcerated through the 50s and most of the 1960s, maybe even the 40s. I'm going to say Russia, but it's USSR for sure. He was actually a petty criminal. There isn't a in this case, though there are some artists here who simply were making art, I think, to make sense of the injustice of wrongful incarceration. That isn't the case in Nedov. But Nedov developed this language of portraiture while he was behind bars, and his medium fascinated me. He's etching on porcelain, and porcelain that he had managed to strip off of old sinks and toilets that had been stored at the prison he was held at. These are small format works that he was able to hide for a while in a statue of Lenin Lenin or Stalin. I think it's Stalin's head. He used that to hide the work while he was doing it. Somewhere along the line, this news of his work made it to Solzhenitsyn, the novelist. Solzhenitsyn includes his story in his Gulag Archipelago. And I think this is an important theme, how work behind bars actually does echo out into the world and bring people into, as I said at the beginning, I'd say my first and simplest fascination with prisons is that we don't know enough about them and we should know more. And when people produce remarkable, curious, strange bodies of art and are able to somehow bring them out into the world, that's one of the few channels where we really do see directly what's going on there. To the right is Marcel Duchamp, and Marcel Duchamp will be, I think, a more familiar figure here. To me, there's something deeply and fascinatingly Duchampian about this entire enterprise. But I include this shot of him from the 1920s. This is 100 years old, and he's got a star-shaped tonsure shaved in his head. And I bring it up just because one aspect of being an artist is devoting your life to a certain kind of freedom, knowing you can do whatever the hell you want to do. And that's precisely what the incarcerated cannot do. That's a level of freedom that they don't enjoy in their work, that their work has to distill on some really kind of primal and sublimated level. But it was the porcelain that got me thinking about this. So that's Duchamp's Fountain of 1917, a urinal that he tipped upside down to bear a slight resemblance to a Madonna and Child. In any case, strange work, but for some reason porcelain stuck with me. These are two pieces by Lenin stacked, as perhaps he wouldn't have done it, next to Duchamp's Large Glass. The Large Glass is a work strangely coded by the domain of the bride above and the bachelors below, and the way that genders do and don't relate or understand each other seemed alive and active in a very different way in the etchings of Leonid or Nedov. And I think I am pretty close here. Sorry. These are two skateboards. I'm going to leave it. Please go find these skateboards in the show. They're incredible. I include them here partly because I love the environmental qualities of the seascape. Almost all the art made, a habit of art behind bars is that it's almost all figurative, that it's almost all portraiture, that often it's self-portraiture or portraits of the fellow incarcerated. And it's been one of the reasons I didn't delve that deeply into it in Corrections and Collections was because it was so much at odds with the economies of abstraction that drive the buildings that house the people. But that polarity, I guess, is another thing to talk about. What do we call it?
Yeah. So it's actually almost time to throw it over to you for questions. Very important, I think, the point you just brought up about the sort of distinction between the kinds of art that one finds in many museums versus that comes out of prisons. Much more representational, much more narrative, perhaps much more expressive. There's a story to tell, and it stands in contradistinction to the extremely Spartan environment in which those artworks are produced. But I'm going to ask one last question, then it's over to the floor. And this is really just about your book. The book you wrote was published in 2013. We're now in 2024. There have been some shifts. And, if you were to write a sequel, sort of what would that sequel say? If I could just sort of quickly bring us up to date. The sentencing project, just on looking at their website, they say that the US continues to lead the world in incarceration. More than 5 million people were under some form of correctional control in 2020, with nearly 2 million in prison or jail, so under 2 million now. However, state lawmakers in at least 15 states and Washington, D.C. have adopted policy reforms in 2022 that may contribute to decarceration. And those measures include a number of things, including specific to our talk today, reducing incarceration for drug offences. So that is perhaps a little bit of a shift. Meanwhile, arguably, there's also been a shift within the sort of museum expansionitis that we've seen. You know, in the last, I think it's fair to say that within the last decade, we've seen kind of social justice movements, from unionizing of cultural workers, you know, through to a lot of protests having to do with investments of trustees, donors, you know, sort of questioning the very ethos of the museum. There's been challenges to sort of the biases within collections, within curation. You mentioned yourself, you know, sorry you're a white, you know, middle-aged white man, Joe, but you mentioned that yourself, you know. And within architecture, there was even a movement within architecture, actually, to take on the ethics of designing prisons. So there's been kind of a big conversation that around these actually kind of, again, oddly intertwining realms. So, yes, if you were to write the sequel, what would it say?
Thank you. Thank you. I've moved into an even more advanced middle-aged white man. I think, you know, and Francis, you and I were talking about this a little bit. It's absolutely the case that a recognition of some of these dynamics has become kind of societally pervasive. We certainly don't want to incarcerate as many people as we did. There are very few people that are really wildly enthusiastic about further incarceration, maybe even within the unions. However, it's hard to take laws off the books. It's been slow progress, and it becomes politically contested as soon as anything goes wrong. So, in terms of stories, I try to follow, you know, the prosecutors that are trying not to take cases to trial because they don't want to overload the prison system, find themselves controversial very, very quickly. And I think the actual reform of the mandatory minimum sentencing laws is starting to happen. And sadly, there's a demographic dimension to this. The opioid crisis has destroyed exponentially more lives than most of the drugs that were more heavily in play when I was researching this. The opioid crisis has also had the net effect of making drug-related sentencing more demographically representative.
Right.
And that, you know, I think in the 80s and 90s, the controversies around sentencing guidelines that were viewed as kind of baldly racist in terms of how they differentiated between different varieties of cocaine, for example. A lot of that debate has simply been overwhelmed by the problem of opioid. But to your point, I think one of the things that happened, and a sequel to my sequel to this will be a book on cinema.
Oh, yes.
And I say that for a reason. I actually believe that the story of prisons and museums that I was trying to capture was, in one important respect, very historically specific to a moment in American urban renewal. Museums and prisons primed a lot of American cities for a huge boom in urban renewal that we're still in the, I don't know if we're in the later phases or whether it's simply playing out, but downtown LA is a very different place to live than it was 30 years ago. Most American cities are different, and they're different in part because their urban renewal began with a new museum of contemporary art that took over some old factory and made a few blocks around it slightly more marketable real estate, for better and for worse, for the people living there.
You're talking about the Geffen Contemporary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or even further south, you know, the Gary's earlier aerospace.
Aerospace.
Yeah, I mean, but they happen all over the United States, and I think that's one of the more benign. It's interesting that with gentrification, it's more complicated, but in any case, new museums did one thing in a far less heralded way. Our huge prison expansion led to the demand for these huge justice hubs in cities. So we built, in addition to big networks of prisons, huge urban jails. And what urban jails do urban jails feed those prison systems, but everybody in the jail can leave for lunch except the inmates. And so that means that you save the little Tokyos and Chinatowns of a lot of American cities with lunch traffic. And so one of the early primers, like both of these building types, and they're also, oddly, both building types that don't have huge payrolls. Prisons a bit, but museums are remarkable for how much bespoke space they include and how few people they need to employ to oversee it. So unlike a sports facility or a theatrical development, they're early in the urban renewal process. So the sequel is, to my mind, the sequel is simply playing out in other building types.
So interesting. I slightly misunderstood my directions, and as it turns out, we don't have time for questions from the floor. However, there is going to be a reception, and Joe is going to be present and available to take all questions, correct? Because as you heard, he's quite brilliant, and we only got to touch on the themes of his book, which is so very interesting. I want to thank you, Joe, for illuminating all of us on this topic. You do pull together some, you know, are these threads interrelated? Are they not? You make such a persuasive argument. I'm going to thank you. I thank you all for being here and witnessing this. And I'm now going to throw it over to Justin, who has something to say.
First of all, thanks again to Joe and Francis, everyone. Amazing. This is one of those rare occasions when I get to reflect on the way in which spaces, adaptive reuse is one of the themes that Joe and I talk a lot about, how spaces can exist as one thing or built for one thing, and then they transform into something else. And I thought so much about that, not only because the way that your book informed this exhibition, but also this very building which was built by the military. And it does make me think sometimes about what's the future use of so many of these buildings, maybe the future use of prisons. Will they be used for the arts? And weirdly, what's amazing is, in the sort of swords to plowshares type way, armories are fantastic for culture arts uses because they would drill in these large spaces. They needed them to be big enough. And it's kind of what you want for gathering spaces. And where we are right now, this only exists here. It wasn't built out because this is where they had all their tanks. So we're sitting right here on what was an asphalt lot 5 years ago with barbed wire fences. And now sometimes I reflect on the way in which, you see butterflies and birds, and this idea that the essence of space, even if you don't change it that much, the utility of it, the use of it can change its spirit and its essence. And that essence and spirit is what was the thread while reading your book, while hearing you today. Francis, you got so much from it. It was amazing what we can pack in such a short amount of time. I hope you'll join us at the reception. But before we all leave, I would like to invite up to the stage for a special presentation. This is kind of a surprise for you guys. Mayor of Culver City, Yasmin Amani McMorrin. Come on up, Yasmin. Put your hands together for our mayor of Culver City. And thanks so much for being here, Yasmin. This is quite an impressive group of people we have on stage. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic to Yasmin.
Thanks so much, Justin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Yasmin Amani McMorrin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the youngest serving council member, the only woman on the council, and the first woman of color and Black woman to be mayor of Culver City. So I'm very grateful and honored to serve. It's always a treat to be here in this beautiful space. I'm so grateful to Justin for the invitation, and Jules, I don't know where you went, but very grateful for your leadership, all the amazing staff. It's just always a beautiful, inviting, community-based space, and just grateful for how you bring folks into Culver City. And I don't know how many of y'all are residents or just here maybe for the first time, but just welcome and thank you. Thank you for joining us. So I have some certificates of recognition because This was a very fantastic occasion. I mean, one of the things I say frequently from the dais, and just something that I believe, is that so much more than the status quo is possible. And when we start thinking and getting curious about and asking the question why, about why we've made certain decisions, or why our policies reflect in certain ways, or why the disproportionalities are. There's so much power in just that question. So I'm grateful for this exhibit. I look forward to taking another spin around and checking everything out. But I just want to celebrate you all and your leadership for being here with us today. So I'm going to quickly read. It's always a little challenge here with the certs. But on behalf of the City Council of the City of Culver City, I hereby award the Certificate of Recognition to Francis and also to Joe, but I'll just read one for now. On behalf of the City Council of the City of Culver City, we collectively express our gratitude for your outstanding contributions to the community. As a passionate advocate for urban design, architecture, and cultural heritage, you have enriched our city through insightful journalism, thought-provoking interviews, and a commitment to fostering dialogue. We commend your dedication and contribution to the City of Culver City and wish you well in your continued endeavors. So this is for you.
Thank you.
I don't know if they're exactly alike. Nope, they're not exactly. So I want to make sure to give Joe some shine as well. So on behalf of the City of Culver City, we collectively express our gratitude for your significant contributions to the history of architecture. You invite us to understand our aspirations, our contradictions, and our shared humanity through the exploration of architectural systems. Your research and insightful narratives have helped to inform the One Day Museum's exhibition, Visions of Transcendence, Creating Space in East and West. We commend your dedication and contribution to Culver City and the greater Los Angeles areas, and we wish you well in your continued endeavors. Thank you so much. So that's it for me. I will pass it back over to Justin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Mayor Yasmin Amani McMorrin. And how awesome to have a mayor like that. You know, we're the only full-time museum in Culver City, and it's amazing to be in a small town when I can just call the mayor up, tell her what we're working on. She'll come by, give us good feedback. We do great events out here, great parties. By the way, for all of you who are new to the museum, you're about to experience that right now. Join us for one of those legendary parties here at the reception. I'll see you at the bar. Thanks, everybody.